a little bit later. And Jemma Forte, broadcaster and author, is with us too. They're ready to take your questions on 0345 6060 973. And if you're not watching us on Global Player, why on earth not?
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's crack on because there's so much to get through tonight. Terry in Watford has our first question. Hi, Terry.
Hi, Ian. Hi, panel.
Hello.
Does the PM have a leg to stand on talking about personal responsibility?
Natasha.
Thanks, Ian.
You
for
didn't
coming
think I was
to me
going to come
first.
to you first, did you?
I did not. I think, Terry, that's a good question because I suspect you, like me, are a little bit confused after the announcements today because I don't entirely trust the Prime Minister's motivations when it comes to COVID restrictions. I really want to hear from Chris Whitty or somebody.
We just did for an hour.
Did we?
Yeah. And
I was
Balance.
travelling in. Did they agree?
They kind of did. I mean, they did give a slightly different message to the Prime Minister, but there was nothing where you could say, well, why haven't they resigned over this then?
Sure. Okay. So thank you for clarifying, Ian.
Anytime.
So up until an hour ago, we hadn't heard from Chris Whitty or Patrick Vallance. And I think you're right that this is not the right person to be delivering a message about personal responsibility. And I also don't think that we have seen that the entire British population can practice consideration to others. Some can, but this pandemic has not shown everyone in a good light.
Wouldn't you say that the majority of people have been remarkably compliant?
The majority, but it only takes a small minority, particularly when you have a variant. We don't know what's going to happen with future variants that maybe is more transmissible or more serious. And that being the case, they don't do the right thing even when there are restrictions in place.
The fact is, the Prime Minister was proved right over not putting the country into lockdown over Christmas. If not now, when in lifting these restrictions? Because I think anybody that criticises him for lifting the restrictions now, surely it's incumbent on them to say, OK, well, I don't think that they should do it now, but then they should do it maybe in a month or 3 months or 6 months or whatever.
I'm not criticising him for lifting the restrictions. I think he could have done more to support people who have to shield in terms of giving people support when they have to take time off work and allowing people who are vulnerable to test before they show symptoms. All I'm saying is that because it was the Prime Minister delivering it, just like Terry's question would suggest, it was confusing because I didn't know what his motivations were.
Peter Hitchens.
Well, I don't think the question of his responsibility really has much to do with it. I mean, I thought that he was hugely irresponsible 2 years ago when he shut down the country.
Right at the beginning.
Right at the beginning. I've always said that it was a huge overreaction, immensely damaging, and unjustified by the circumstances. It was like a man who discovers a wasp's nest and sets fire to his house to get rid of it. It was and continues to be a huge overreaction. We pay for it increasingly every day, and the immensely increased taxation, inflation, and the major economic problems, and the immense irreparable damage to the National Health Service, which was done. So I don't think it was responsible to do it in the first place. So if we're going to criticise his irresponsibility, that's the point at which to criticise it. It was a mistake. I'm very glad that he's finally been persuaded out of pursuing this course, fundamentally based on the ideas of the People's Republic of China rather than on a free, democratic and law-governed nation. So although I find him a terrible Prime Minister and don't like anything that he's ever done, I'm very glad that he's at least been pulled away from this course of action and we're finally beginning to climb back into being a normal country again. So I'm not going to have a go at his responsibility on this.
What about Natasha's point about that withdrawing free tests from people inevitably is going to hit people at the lower end of the income spectrum because apparently the lateral flow test boxes, they cost £20 each. Now, if you're on a very limited income, that is going to really affect affect your ability to test yourself.
Well, I think it's good criticism, but I think you should listen to it. There's nothing wrong with. I've always thought that the whole purpose of the government in this was to show consideration to those who are most vulnerable and protect them, rather than shutting down the whole country in a failed attempt to protect them. And I've always believed in targeted protections. So no, it's a perfectly good point, and he should listen to it. And he should do what she says. He shouldn't whisk away these tests for people who really need them. But we do need to remove the constant interference in people's lives and the disastrous closing down of our society.
Well, I feel my work is already done, uniting Natasha and Peter within the first 5 minutes of the programme. Jemma.
It's interesting because I think we all agree that lockdown was a horrendous thing to have to go through. But for me, it was a necessary evil because you simply would have had people gasping for breath outside hospitals, which I just don't think you can allow to happen in one of the richest countries in the world. And
well, hang on a second. Could I just ask you on what basis you say that?
Well, on the basis that when the pandemic first hit, it was actually in Italy, and they were struggling beyond. They didn't know what had hit them, and people were in corridors gasping their last breath. It was extraordinarily traumatic for the health service, and as a result of lockdown, which I agree, nobody loved lockdown. Lockdown was awful. Maybe never do it again. I've got 2 teenagers. It wasn't great, of course, but I really do believe that we needed to make sure that the health service could cope. And that we weren't in that kind of... We're a first world country. You cannot... There were already people queuing up in ambulances in really, really dire straits.
But again, could I say, there's very little evidence that the lockdowns actually... The severity of lockdown has any relationship with the outcome. And as I constantly say, because it needs to be said over and over again, Sweden did not follow the course which we did, and it did not experience what you said might happen. It simply didn't happen. Both Britain and Sweden did catastrophically mishandle their care homes, but that's the one thing they have in common.
It's a very different country, though, isn't it, Peter?
No, it isn't, actually.
You haven't got the urban centres that we have in this country.
Well,
it's a very dispersed
Stockholm
population. It's 1 million people, isn't it?
Stockholm is a very large city, and it has very high density. Just look into it. Sweden is largely uninhabited. It's an extremely urbanised society. It's not a valid point to make. It really and truly you need to examine
for
that.
quite a long time now. I find it quite interesting, the language of sort of freedom that's being used in Parliament today. I have felt for the last few months we live in a completely free society, calling it restrictions, I prefer to call them protections. And 2 of those protections that I personally believe perhaps we need for a bit longer, according to so many experts, are the free tests, so that people can just know where they're at, and because that will affect the poorest in society, and then having to isolate if you're ill. I just think that's an obvious for a bit longer, but here we are. And I, like Natasha, am at a point now where I don't trust the motivation. And this is the point. Perhaps it is the right time. It could be. We can't go on forever, and that's fine. But when you've got a Prime Minister that you know is being investigated by the police, and he's got enormous pressure from one strand of his party, a potential leadership contest, this is the problem.
Do you think, Peter, that is a motivation with the timing of this?
It might well be. There's never a mistake to seek out a low motivation in politics, but I'm glad of the outcome, so that doesn't really particularly trouble me.
Crispin.
Well, Peter's quite entitled to challenge all the official advice going to ministers who are making the decisions and to say there should be an alternative approach. Of course, it can't be tested unless you look at countries like Brazil, where that approach was tested, not spectacularly successful. And the decisions that have been made by the government over the course of the whole 2 years in taking on this pandemic have, by and large, in my judgment, been correct. And they've... if you imagine that you're sitting there you're not a scientist as a minister, you're receiving scientific and medical advice, and you've then got to collectively come to the right judgment. You've got to engage with social policy as well. It's about what messages you're going to get across in order to keep people compliant with the general direction of what you're trying to get people to do. None of this is easy, and I think the United Kingdom made as good a fist of it as it possibly could have done in the circumstances.
It depends what criteria you use, though, doesn't it? Because if you look at the death rate, I mean, we're not at the top of the European League table anymore, but of the larger companies, we're certainly at the top in terms of them, in terms of
and obviously we rattled up to the top of the league pretty quickly, as our Prime Minister knows, because he was very close to being put on a ventilator, and in those days, being put on a ventilator in April, when the first year of this pandemic, was singularly bad news. And he was, if you were following his the course of his illness and his path, he's very lucky to have survived.
In the press conference, which I don't think any of you saw, he said we should be more like Germany, where they do all stay at home voluntarily if they get COVID and all the rest of it. That's all very well. In Germany, they have 100% sick pay. In this country, I think it's 19%. Now, if you couple that with the point that Natasha made about the £20 costs of lateral flow tests, I mean, we shouldn't be surprised if people don't necessarily do the right thing because they won't be in a position to, some people.
And those disincentives to do the right thing have then got to be addressed if they become apparent. But the broad strategic direction now is let's get the country going, let's get back to work, and let's kick on with all the advantages that we now have to take our place in the world as a free and independent nation.
Natasha?
Do you know, it really worried me, though, when the Prime Minister said we should treat this as any other illness, for example, flu, because I think when people are ill, they do tend to still go into work, either because they can't afford to miss work or because we live in a culture which it thinks that going into work whilst you're still sick is akin to a moral judgment. I mean, you only have to look at some of the headlines about the Queen.
I mean, I do it. I've done it before, where I just have this thing, I'm not taking a day off, even when I probably know that I should do.
And you infect the rest of the office. And then presenteeism is one of the biggest costs to businesses in the UK, where people are physically there, but because they're sick, either mentally or physically, they aren't performing as they should.
Terry in Watford, what's the answer to your own question?
Yeah, so apart from Boris Johnson being the wrong person to deliver the message because of his own conduct, I would say that poor people can't necessarily afford. Is it £59 for a PCR test? You're asking people to act responsibly, but I'd say the government are acting irresponsibly, taking those safety nets away. As far as dropping the restrictions and that side of things, I'm really happy about that.
Right. Well, you're half happy then. Terry, thank you very much indeed for your question. I'll settle for half happy on this programme, frankly. We'll take more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:15.
This is LBC.
Whether
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
It's Cross Question with Peter Hitchens, Natasha Devon, Crispin Blunt and Jemma Forte. Our next caller is Maya in Tottenham. Maya, hi, what's your question, please?
Hi, yes, I just wanted to know, why do you think Boris Johnson is so keen to get us involved in the Ukrainian tensions?
What do you mean by involved?
Well, he seems very keen to get us involved that we're sending troops there, we're helping to train them. We're very much involved in that in a way that countries like other European countries are not. So I'm just wondering why you think he's so keen.
Well,
compared to other countries.
We're not sending troops to Ukraine, but Peter Hitchens.
Well, we have sent troops to other parts of Eastern Europe, and we have got very politically and diplomatically involved in Ukraine, that's for sure. It is a reasonable question to ask why Britain, which has no visible interests in this matter, is so vigorously taking sides, sending ministers to Moscow to lecture the government there. And you have to ask, what is it that is so important about Ukraine to us, and why so many countries are getting involved, as if this was, as it is portrayed on so many broadcasting organisations and in so many newspapers, a kind of cartoon contest between a lovely, utopian, democratic, marvellous Ukraine and villainous, Mordor-like Russia ruled by a dark lord. It isn't like that. It's much more complicated, and a lot of the problems which exist now are the result of very foolish Western diplomacy over about 20 years. It's amazing to me. I watched the Soviet Union collapse. I was in Moscow when it collapsed. It was one of the greatest joys of my life to see it happen, to then see the opportunity given by that moment thrown away by idiotic diplomacy and politics ever since, and the turning of Russia, a potential friend, into an enemy, seems to me to have been one of the craziest things we did.
That's quite an interesting point, because, again, you probably haven't seen this, because Putin was, I don't know whether it was a press conference, he was just sitting in his office, I think, talking for about 90 minutes. And one of the things he said was that President Clinton came to see him right towards the end of his presidency. And Putin said, well, what about Russia joining NATO then? And Clinton just sort of completely pushed back on that. Do you think that was a mistake?
Well, there was a lot of discussion about that. It was never really practical, but the big European organisations, NATO and the European Union, would both be completely overbalanced by having Russia in them. I think everybody knows that it was never going to happen, but that there were other things that could have been done. Right at the beginning of all this, in the 1990s, George Kennan, who was the architect of American Cold War policy against Russia, who designed the containment policy, came out of retirement to say that the plan which Clinton was pushing to expand NATO eastwards was incredibly stupid and dangerous. Major Russian liberal democratic politicians such as Yegor Gaidar warned against it. Gaidar actually called up at one stage his friend, the Canadian ambassador in Moscow, and said, for heaven's sake, will you tell these people this is disastrous for democracy and freedom in Russia? It strengthens the nationalists. It makes it far more likely that there will be conflict. It puts them back. Yet we carried on pushing for this policy over and over again, and we were warned over and over again that it would cause trouble. Putin himself, at his speech to the Munich conference, 2007, said, what is all this for? Why are you doing this? Why are you pushing? And nobody paid any attention at all. And that, in my view, is why we've ended up here. It's not a simple matter of Russia bad, everybody else good, by any manner of means. And what is baffling in it is what Britain's interest in it are, and I do share your caller's wonderment as to exactly what Britain sees as its role or purpose in this.
What you're effectively doing, though, is dismissing Ukraine as a faraway country of which we know nothing.
I've said nothing of the kind. No, it's a faraway country of which I probably know quite a bit and have been to several times. And I'm not dismissing it at all. I'm just saying it's more complicated. Nations,
surely it is incumbent on a member of the UN Security Council, i.e. Britain, to question Russian motivations for incursions into a sovereign country.
Indeed it is, and surely it's also incumbent on any member of the Security Council to wonder about how this actually began, and how did it begin? And it began in 2014, and ever since the overthrow of President Marcos in the Philippines, one of the favoured methods of countries which wish to interfere in other countries is to arrange through people power demonstrations and the rest of it to overthrow their governments. In 2014, openly backed by people such as Victoria Nuland, now a senior official in Washington, and Catherine Ashton, who was the High Representative, the Chief of Foreign Policy of the European Union, and major German figures such as Guido Westerwelle, all went to Ukraine to back a demonstration which eventually turned extremely violent and led to the unconstitutional overthrow of the Ukrainian government in pursuit of bringing Ukraine into an agreement with the European Union, which had political and military clauses. And this was an extremely aggressive piece of diplomacy, to put it mildly. That was the start of these events. And nobody seems to grasp that since 1945, invading the country next door is not the way in which you actually take aggressive steps. It's done by other means.
Crispin Blunt.
Well, I would say it starts a little bit earlier. Let's go back to, you can argue that it starts with the Russians being booted out of Afghanistan or lacking the will to go on in Afghanistan. And that lack of will then showed itself in the collapse of the Warsaw Pact countries and the ending of the division of Germany and the movement of people across the borders without Soviet intervention to stop the whole Soviet empire unravelling. And then the West was faced with a choice, and I have some sympathy, not overwhelming sympathy, with the point that Peter's making, actually, that the big prize was Russia, securing Russia within the family of nations. But I went to Russia in 1993 when I was working for Malcolm Rifkin. At the time that the parliament was dissolved by then President Yeltsin, that the communists and the fascists who had been elected to the parliament, rival red and brown demonstrations outside the parliament. Russia had collapsed. It was a basket case. People couldn't go to the cash machine, expect to get money out. The country was in very serious trouble. And we had a choice, but we had a strategic choice.
But we can't go through the whole history.
Right, no, sure,
because the question is about why Boris Johnson is keen to get us involved.
Okay, but we had a strategic choice at that point about whether we secured the Baltic states, for example, all those countries who were unwilling partners in the whole Soviet experiment, or whether we tried to secure Russia within the family of nations. And I think there's a perfectly proper case to be made to say that we made the right decision, because actually securing Russia within the democratic family of nations would not, in the end, have proved possible.
We didn't try. There was no effort made. And you mentioned Yeltsin. And Yeltsin...
Well, we certainly tried with China.
Didn't just dissolve. Well, here's a contrast, isn't it? At the end of the 1980s, the Chinese state massacred its own people in Peking.
With respect,
this is a totally important...
We can't get onto China. We're trying to do the whole of Russian history.
We can go on to China because there's a fascinating contrast. The Western powers watched as China massacred its own people, set up an immensely repressive state, made no attempt to be democratic, crushed the life out of Tibet and out of the Uyghur areas, and also continued to threaten Taiwan repeatedly. We treated China as a friend and a client, while Russia voluntarily withdrew from a vast Asian and
European. In the same way, we could not secure China.
I didn't interrupt you, so don't do it to me.
Okay.
I will get interrupted for saying because it's not conventional wisdom, but it's true.
We need to move on to Jemma.
Well, I'm not going to start pontificating about what I think Putin's going to do, because I've got no idea, and I think most people don't. I don't think maybe even Putin knows at this stage.
But in terms of Britain's role here,
so I think that it's an opportunity for Johnson to put his leader hat on, in much as the same way as he likes to put a builder hat on, or he likes to. This is his...
Well, he does happen to be the Prime Minister.
Exactly. So he has got to have a say. We have got to have a say on the global stage. But I'm sorry, I hate to say it, there was a video that the Conservatives put out, and I found it, if I'm honest, really tasteless, because it was him walking in slow motion, speaking about the situation in Russia, and then they put this sort of music over the top of it, like from an action film, as if they were casting Johnson as Jason Bourne. And I just thought ghastly. It was really inappropriate.
I'm glad I missed
Well, I don't think you want to hold the entire government to account for some production as the media department as Conservatives.
No, of course, and I don't. But this is the thing that, lots of... but I think they have got to think about the tone. It was sort of tasteless at best and a bit sinister at worst.
But if you look at what the Ukrainians are saying, President Zelensky seems seems to regard Britain as his main ally in this. I mean, there are Ukrainians singing God Save the Queen outside the British Embassy because Britain has taken a different role or a different line to that of France and Germany. Now, do you think that that was the right thing for us to do?
I'm not sure. And all I know is that Macron seems to be having these long conversations. Obviously, Biden is doing his bit.
Waving
sure.
a white flag, basically.
Yeah, waving a white flag. But I know that maybe when Liz Truss went over, she perhaps didn't give the best account of herself. Wasn't there some confusion over where certain places were?
She didn't know where Ukraine ended and Russia began, which is a minor fault in most of us, but a major one in a foreign secretary, I tend to think, especially one who's intervening in that very subject.
Natasha?
Well, I'm not as knowledgeable about the history as either Crispin or Peter, but as far as I can see, the major link between Britain and Russia is a financial one, and that's where a lot of Russia's power comes from. And London in particular is known as a hotspot for Russian money laundering. There was an organisation that found that there were millions of pounds worth of property which are linked to investors from the Kremlin, and there was also, I think there was about 48 cases of Russian money laundering which was either connected to London or some of our other countries abroad that we are connected to. So I think that there is a chance that Boris Johnson is just trying to do the right thing. I mean, Jemma could be right, and it could be posturing to distract from Partygate or to try and kind of do an image reset after all the catastrophes that have beleaguered his government recently. But I think it could just be a simple case of trying to do the right thing, perhaps.
Potentially. I think these economic sanctions are really interesting because exactly what you were talking about. Apparently there's 6,500 empty houses in the borough of Kensington and Chelsea that are essentially like laundromats for Russian money, and they were given certain residential visas when they're not going to be there. So, I mean, that's wrong on so many levels. I hope that that's something that the government look at going forward.
It's being looked at. There are measures coming forward. There are measures put forward over the last 3 years, 3 to 5 years, which Ben Wallace was talking to the House of Commons about today, about a security minister putting economic crime measures forward, and there'll be more.
But what does this have to do with the growing threat we're constantly told of a war in Ukraine? I mean, I couldn't care less if you chuck out...
Well, you're trying to raise the price.
You chuck out Russian money and you chuck out Middle Eastern money. We're much too beholden to that part of the world as well. But that's not the point here. Why is Britain involved? Britain, which barely has a navy anymore, much of it spends most of its time tied up alongside because it can't move, and it's cut its army to the smallest strength it's had in about 200 years. How do we then make ourselves out to be a major power in Europe? Singing God Save the Queen outside the British Embassy in Kiev, which apparently we've evacuated anyway, doesn't seem to betoken very much.
I don't think we have. The Americans
I thought we were going to... No, I thought
well, I think some staff have left, but the ambassador is still there.
Operational centre has moved to
Peter, you were dividing...
Lviv, if you don't mind, as we now have to call it, I think. Changes its name a lot.
Peter, you're dividing opinion. I know this is unusual for you. But, Jean says, Peter Hitchens talking his usual drivel, while an admirer says, Peter has the huskiest voice. More, please, Iain.
So drivel in a husky voice. It's what you want, that's what you'll get. I don't know why she thinks it's drivel, I'm afraid. Perhaps
we have another half hour of this to go. We're looking forward to hearing more from all of our panellists. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:31 news headlines on LBC with Andy Ivey.
President Putin has signed decrees recognising as independent the self-proclaimed republics of Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine. Boris Johnson has described the development as extremely bad news and says the UK will be discussing with allies the potential implementation of sanctions against Moscow. From Thursday, people who test positive for coronavirus in England will no longer be legally required to self-isolate. Under the government's plan for living with COVID, free symptomatic and asymptomatic testing for the general public will end from April the 1st. Labour has called the announcement half-baked. More than 250 flood warnings and alerts are in place across England and Wales following heavy rain brought by Storm Franklin. 2 are severe, meaning a danger to life, for the River Severn in Ironbridge in Shropshire and Bewdley in Worcestershire. LBC weather, clear spells for a time overnight. Tomorrow, a band of rain and strong winds in the north moving southeast and easing. Sunny spells and scattered showers following and a high of 12 degrees.
This is LBC.
Date night.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Lorraine says, Peter does talk some twaddle, but not going to lie, his voice is kind of hot. Have you ever had this on a programme before, Peter?
Never.
Well, you'll come back, won't you? We have Peter Hitchens with us from the Mail on Sunday, Natasha Devon, my LBC colleague, Crispin Blunt, Conservative MP for Reigate, co-chair of the APPG on drug policy reform, and Jemma Forte, the broadcaster and author. Right, our next questions come in by email. By the way, you can not just phone, you can email or text as well, 84850 on the text. Email Iain, IAIN, @lbc.co.uk. Amar says, is it time to legalise cannabis? I could go to Peter first, but I did on the last question, so I'm going to go to Crispin as chair of the APPG on drug reform.
Well, what we need to do is follow the evidence. And what we haven't had is a drugs policy at all of any kind that's actually based on empirical evidence. And the world took a position in 1961 under a UN convention to prohibit all narcotics. And we've been coping with the consequences ever since. And one of those consequences was putting medicine from cannabis back about 50 years, because it then became very difficult to do research into it. And so you've got a very large number of people who are self-medicating. They're putting themselves at risk of a 14-year prison sentence in order to grow their own medicine. It's not a very clever place to be in. And what we don't have is enough research and science that underpins whether or not what they're doing in terms of self-medicating, they're doing the right thing for themselves. But you try convincing people out there who've got multiple sclerosis and they're not getting symptomatic relief with the use of cannabis as a medicine, even if they've had to grow it themselves at home. And so what we actually need is much more science and research to underpin the policy, to understand what the implications are of prohibition. That is pretty well established, because by any standards, our drug policy, in terms of its outcomes, is a disaster. We have the worst drug deaths in Europe. We have handed a very big industry into the hands of organised crime. I thought
Switzerland had that accolade.
Not anymore.
Okay.
And Switzerland and Portugal are the two examples in Europe of where the approach of decriminalisation of personal use has enabled to get people into healthcare, has tidied the streets up. Portugal back in 1999 had a death rate that was approaching ours. Ours is actually higher now, right across the country. But that was seen as such a crisis that they then took the radical step of putting in place a legislative framework to decriminalise personal use. It meant that supply was still criminal, and if you were lifted now with quantities of drugs that look as though you're a dealer rather than simply drugs for your own use, you're obviously open to full sanction of the law, but if it's you've got stuff for your own use, if it's then seen as a problem, you can then be directed into that.
So your answer to the question, is it time to legalise cannabis, I'm sensing would be yes.
Of course the question is rather more complicated.
Is it?
Because you've got medicine from cannabis, and we legalised that in 2018. We made a pretty pitiful job of it, because there have been 3 prescriptions on the National Health Service in the ensuing 3 years. We set up quite a nice private medical industry where if you've got £8,000 a year or that sort of order, you can go and get your cannabis medicine prescribed to you by a doctor. But the policy outcome is a mess, and we need to get it into a sensible place where people have confidence in the policy.
But on the general legalisation, I'm not quite sure.
On legalisation for adult use, I think the government is set against that for now, but what we have the opportunity to do is to look at all the examples of the countries.
No, but I'm asking you for your opinion.
My opinion would be a presumptive yes. But then
that's what I thought. But I couldn't quite understand why you were being so hesitant about it.
Because we actually need to get to policy based on evidence. And I think whatever my opinion is, I would want that buttressed by all the available evidence. We've got the opportunity to do a study of Canada and Uruguay and the 13 states of the Union of the United States who have gone down the legalisation route. Let's see what they've done. And what's critical about whether legalisation would be a success or not is how you do it. What are the licence conditions? What are the that you place around it? What are the restrictions that you place around it? What are the taxes you impose on it? How do you do it? Is as important a question as seeing whether you're going to get a public policy success than the simple yes or no answer.
Jemma Forte.
I think it is time to legalise cannabis. I think that what's been happening in Portugal is really, really interesting. I think that it would save a lot of police resources, and let's face it, they could do with that because we don't have enough police officers at the moment. I also think that alcohol is arguably as damaging as cannabis, and I think that if it was legalised, more damaging, and also if it's legalised, then actually the stuff that you could get would be regulated. Whereas, so I talk to my children about everything. Of course, you hope your kids aren't going to do drugs, but it's completely unrealistic to think that, to assume that. You just can't. So I'd rather have honest conversations. And I know that if you get laced weed, for instance, that's something that could give you psychosis and could actually make you more ill than anything than doing heroin, or it could
because
really
you have a criminal
give you huge mental health issues. So if they were going to go and try something, I'd rather it was something that had been sold over the counter, just as you go in the pub and get a glass of wine. That's my personal view, and that comes from someone who did experience a friend when I was young have psychosis from just smoking whatever he got his hands on, and it was horrendous. And it's this interesting, when kids go to festivals now, there's a tent that they can go to where if they've got drugs, they can sort of have them tested before. And again, as a parent, you're like, don't do drugs, don't do anything. But actually, again, to have these difficult conversations, you think, and I don't think mine have yet, but if they're going to, I'd rather they went and made sure it was safe.
Natasha.
I mean, everything that Jemma said, I would echo, but also with my kind of mental health hat on, I would say we know so much more about addiction now and the nature of addiction. And what's understood now is that there are very few substances which are in of themselves addictive, that it's the psychological addiction that people develop. And if you're psychologically addicted to something, you will do anything to get it. So I would much rather it was regulated. With these stronger strains, as you say, there is a link with psychosis. It can make people very poorly. And with taking my professional hat off and just putting my human hat on, I've been to areas of the world where cannabis is legal, and the only way I can describe them is they're less aggy than cultures which rely heavily on alcohol. It seems much more mellow. There's fewer fights, I should say. There seems to be less crime, less criminal activity going on. I mean, there is the question of, would we legalise alcohol now if we knew as much about it as we do now? But it seems to me that if we're going to legalise one, it doesn't make any sense not to legalise the other.
Peter, you've written a lot about this and been very vocal on it. What do you make of the arguments that have been put forward so far?
Well, I just am astonished at how many years I've been saying what I've been saying, and nobody ever listens to a word that I say, even though it's all true and nothing can be challenged about it. The first thing about marijuana is that it is well known, and Professor Sir Robin Murray of the Maudsley Hospital in South London is very well aware of it and will come and say so to you if you ask him. It's well known that there is such a strong correlation between marijuana use and mental illness that it's undeniable. I don't actually advance a causal relationship because one's not been proved, but it would be extraordinarily unwise to believe that you could take this drug without severe danger. I know of one particular case, my good friend Patrick Coburn, one of the greatest foreign correspondents alive, his son Henry, who took marijuana, began to take it at his grammar school in Canterbury, as nice a place as you might find. Henry's life has more or less been ruined, and if you want to know the horrible details of what happened to their family, then you can read it in a book called Henry's Demons, which he wrote with his father. I'd rather continue, if I may. I'd let everybody else speak without interruption, and I think I would ask the same in return, especially this particular point.
I wasn't going to tell you.
I still would rather not be interrupted, even so, because the point here is this, that when Patrick wrote this, he was approached soon afterwards by many, many, many friends and colleagues who said, this has happened to me. It's not uncommon, it's very common, it's extremely widely known, it's a major scourge. And to legalise a drug with that disadvantage, or even to call it a medicine, seems to me to be extremely dangerous. Leave that aside. The other arguments put forward, that if you legalise it, then you can regulate it. There are many places now, particularly in the United States, which have actually legalized cannabis for recreational use, including California. If you look at the sales figures, you'll find that the overwhelming sales continue to be done by criminal gangs because they can sell more cheaply and they can avoid the tax. And so the idea of regulation is fatuous. It will not happen. It does not happen. It's an argument which has already been exploded by practical experience. The other thing people will say, nobody said it tonight because perhaps they're tired of repeating a cliche, the war on drugs has failed. There's been no war on drugs in this country. The book that I wrote, The War We Never Fought, describes how the police and the criminal justice system collapsed in face of cannabis legalization campaigners from the 1960s onwards, and we just don't do it. The number of people who are actually prosecuted for possession of marijuana is tiny, and the police would not be saved any trouble if they were told not to do it because they don't do it anyway. Whereas what you find in two extremely important jurisdictions, democratic, free, law-governed, advanced countries, Japan and South Korea, is they prosecute for possession of marijuana, and they have much, much less use of it. It would work. It worked here. I'm old enough to remember when it worked here in the 1960s. It would work here if we did it. But the campaign, what I call the big dope campaign to legalize it, is immensely strong and extremely well funded and sees a huge possibility. It's very like big tobacco in its conscienceless pursuit of profit at the expense of human misery. It will do anything to get this drug legalized because of the huge profits. And many politicians foolishly believe that the tax income from it will justify this too. But the point about alcohol, and I agree, alcohol is a terrible scourge, is that it's irreversible, its legalization, and so would the legalization of marijuana be. And if you legalized it, you would not be able to go back. It's not a decision to be taken lightly, and it's certainly not a decision to be taken on the basis of the almost total absence of knowledge of the drug and of its effects and of the things that have been done about it already in the world, which has been displayed, I'm sorry to say, by everybody else here this evening.
Natasha?
I was just wondering, I'm sorry to hear what happened to your friend Peter, but I wonder whether...
So was he.
But I wonder whether sometimes the chain of causation works the other way, and that when people are in psychological distress, they maybe use cannabis as a coping tool for that, and whether we're too quick to say that there is this causal link with mental illness and cannabis use, when it's not the strain that can cause psychosis, which we know quite a lot about, whether actually people are self-medicating because there isn't enough other forms of support out there for them.
But both the Swedish Army study and the Dunedin study show that this isn't so. The mental illness comes after the cannabis use.
Crispin, did not the Prime Minister promise you that there would be a reform of the laws on psychedelic drugs? Why hasn't that happened?
I don't know why it hasn't happened. Well, I do know why it's happened, because it went back to the Home Office and it's grinding its way through the gears of reform within the Home Office.
Why would he promise you that, though?
What I believe to have happened is that he had a paper from his policy unit recommending that the psychedelics were rescheduled. It doesn't mean legalising them. It simply means rescheduling to make the research easier. It takes them from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2.
I don't even know what psychedelics are.
I know, exactly. Well, so magic mushrooms are a psychedelic. Okay. So with the active component is psilocybin. And that's one of them. And one of the main arguments for reform in this area is there was already developing science in the late 1960s about the ability of dosing with psychedelics under medical supervision to then help the cognitive behaviour therapies and psychotherapy in order to work to address things like trauma and depression and addiction. And we are actually on the cusp, I think, of a major step forward in mental health treatment. If we can get psychotherapy and all the cognitive behaviour therapies being reinforced by sensible, informed application of doses of with the right psychedelic, and we put ourselves 50 years behind in terms of the science, and it's a tragedy for all those people who whose kids are taking their own lives, who not just get tragically ill, like Patrick Coburn's kid, but actually they get so depressed they can't escape the cycle, and they kill themselves. There are 6,000 people a year, more than that, who are killing themselves in the UK because of depression.
Marilla says, finally, presenter who knows her grammar, less versus fewer, respect for Natasha Devon. Absolutely, it's one of my pet hates. I even pull up callers on that sometimes. Or should I say pull callers up? I'm not sure. It's 8:49.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:52. Paul says, who would be the left winger on your panel? Well, I think the two ladies to my left and right, I would say, were vaguely to the left at least. And would you agree with that?
I would say that I'm a socialist ideologically, but I'm not tribal. If I think Boris Johnson's done something right, I will say.
But Peter, you can be a bit of a lefty as well, can't
Very
you?
much. I'm in favour of renationalising the railways and water and a number of other things. I belong to a trade union all my life, and I'm pretty social democratic in my economic policies, and I don't think actually that conservative social policies are necessarily the preserve of the Conservative Party, which has been pretty useless at actually preserving or applying.
And Crispin, you've got the odd lefty bit in you, haven't you?
Well, I find myself quite difficult to stick in a box, actually.
Right. Anyway, we're running.
I'm definitely in the Conservative Party.
Interesting.
Well, that doesn't tell us anything, does it?
Right, Richard is in Croydon. Hello, Richard.
Hi, Ian. To what extent does the panel feel the mainstream media, blah, blah, is fueling hate in this country?
Now, did I imagine it, but did you spit that phrase out, mainstream media?
Well, the only reason I spat it out is because it's frequently spat out. I didn't mean to spit it out myself.
Okay.
But I was just, as a general term, the mainstream media.
Right, Jemma Forte.
I struggle with the term mainstream media because I don't really know what it means. People seem to quantify it in different ways. I think we've become very tribal. I think we've become a nation that love to shout. And I think a perfect example was the person saying, who's the left winger on the panel? And what's so nice is I don't affiliate myself to any particular party. I'm a bit of a woolly liberal. I'm much more of a lefty, probably, but
you're a bit of a Lib Dem, actually, aren't
probably,
you?
I don't know. I don't like to put a label on it because I just think what I think. But I think since Brexit, particularly, we became a divided nation and people were so passionate on one side or the other. And I think perhaps social media is more divisive than the mainstream media, which I think in the whole does its best to report what is happening. And because I work in TV, I know that every different thing I've been on, the producers genuinely are trying to bring balance and trying to book a variety of different guests. They don't have this agenda that so many people are suspicious of.
Well, let me argue with that a little bit, because sometimes you will have had these calls from, and I know Peter has, from producers on different programmes who say to you, right, we're looking for somebody who's going to say X, Y or Z. And then you say, well, that's not my view. So they then ditch you.
Well, that's what it is. I then don't do it. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So you think that... Okay, so there's an appetite, isn't there, for debate. And sometimes what's interesting is there isn't a debate. So actually, it's a very black and white issue. So I worry sometimes when things like climate change, they try to bring someone on for balance and they maybe say things that are false. And that is a bit of a worry. But I, like you, Ian, when I get a phone call going, oh, but do you maybe think that? I say, no. I prefer to think long term. I'm not saying I'm always right, but I try to say what I think.
But do you think it's harmful that there are some programmes, and you and I appear on one of these programmes together sometimes, where it is about conflict, isn't it? They won't do a subject if they think that you and I agree with each other on it.
That's correct, and they do want clicks. So this is why my argument is more about social media, because actually those shows, they get their viewers who quite like a nuanced discussion and a nuanced debate, and they even will tweet and say it was quite nice because actually it was a lovely feel to the show. But what the producers want is the clickbait on Twitter.
Well, it comes back to the title of this programme. Some people think it should be called Don't Get Very Cross Question, Natasha.
Mainstream media, or what we once would have called mainstream media, is now inextricable with social media. It's all about engagement. It's all about clicks. And one of the easiest emotions to invoke in people in order to get them to look at your content is fear. And it's interesting that Richard has asked this question, because I was on a mainstream media show just this morning talking about a complete non-story, which was reported as an exclusive in the Daily Mail last Friday, which said that schools in Brighton were banning the word mum and dad. bad. And of course, if you read that as a headline, you go, this is a challenge to our way of life. How dare they? What will the wokerati do next? When you looked at the story, it was actually a policy about teachers talking to groups of students. When they don't know the individual family situation of every single pupil in the room, they use the catch-all term grown-up so that everybody feels included. When they're talking to individual students, they use whatever's appropriate for that pupil. And it's been in place for decades in schools all over the country without a single parental complaint. But that's the kind of thing that gets engagement. So, Richard, if you want to see a change in the kind of media that you're experiencing, then make sure that you vote with your clicks and engage with nuanced discussions like the ones that we're having this evening.
Exactly, Peter.
Well, I'm not sure what the question is. If somebody wants to say what it is that they mean by what is it, promoting hate, then I'd like to know what it is that they mean. I mean, I've visited a lot of countries. I counted it up. It's actually 57. And I have a lot of criticisms of this country and a lot of criticisms of practically everything about it. One of the things I will say about it is that compared with most places I've encountered, particularly ones with multiracial countries, we are one of the most harmonious and successful societies free of hate that I've ever come across in my life. And we should be more pleased about it than we are. I think when I go back to and this is another thing, I say I'm one of the most left-wing people on the panel, when I was engaging in campaigns against what we called racialism in the 1960s, things were very different to what they are now, and they have improved immensely and beyond all recognition. If people could be transported back to that time and see what we've got rid of since then, it's something to be pleased about. So what the specific charge is, I don't know. But I suppose I could claim to be part of the mainstream media, writing as I do for a national newspaper. But unless I can be given a specific charge, I can't give you more of an answer than that.
Crispin.
Well, one only has to look at the Times coverage of trans stories, where every day there's another trans story. Now, what on earth is a paper of the status of the Times giving that amount of attention to this, what is actually quite a small issue, which very serious for up to 1% of our population, but it's relentless.
Why do you think they're doing it?
Because there's an agenda being run. It's pretty ugly, and I wish they wouldn't do it, because trans people are hurt by the raising of the salience of the issue, of not being of the consternation and being created in the minds of women about the apparent threat to women's rights, and blowing up the actual level of anxieties to a level which is not sustained by any evidence whatsoever of what the actual effect would be on women. And what we need to do is to calm the debate down, and let's have some light in the debate and much less heat. And it's very amplified on social media, because obviously trans people feel they're under central threat, so they don't take any prisoners, or many of them don't, on social media. And you've then got Mumsnet, which is then suddenly produced a whole area of anxiety for people, which actually there is no evidence for the anxiety they're suffering.
Someone once wrote a book called "Why Can't We All Just Get Along?" I don't know why more people haven't taken any notice of it, Gemma, but there we are. Thank you all very much indeed. No time for our fun text at the end today. You've all been absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. Peter Hitchens, Natasha Devon, Jemma Forte and Crispin Blunt. We'll have another cross question for you tomorrow. Coming up in a moment, we're going to be talking about Ukraine, Russia, President Putin's remarkable speech earlier this evening, and we'll talk about the implications of that. Love to hear your views as well. 0345 6060 973. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has raised tensions with the West by recognising as independent 2 Russian-backed separatist regions in the east of Ukraine. In a televised address,